Good morning, everybody. It's June 26th, 2020, and we're up to episode 58, which I erroneously posted as episode 59.
Yes.
So that was not a
That was-
conspiracy.
I was going to say it was almost a birth of another conspiracy theory.
What happened? The government took down episode 58.
That's right.
Because we're too subversive.
Using 5G.
Robot birds.
Instantaneous. Yeah.
Maybe that's how internet can be. Like, if you have robot birds with Wi-Fi signal, then you can have universal Wi-Fi, which also means universal surveillance.
There you go.
There you go. And it's all funded by Bill Gates and George Soros working together.
Yes.
Explains it all.
It does. It's sort of like in physics. They're looking for the universal theory, the fundamental theory of everything.
Yeah.
We could create that with conspiracy theories. There could be a fundamental conspiracy theory that covers every conspiracy theory, interlocks all of them.
I already know what that is.
What?
Existence itself.
There we go.
Well, anyways, we should introduce ourselves. I'm a little tired, so this could go either way. I could either be kind of dopey or loopy. We'll see what happens. But I'm Mark Van Steenhoek. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. Good morning, Kathleen.
And today we're talking about the promise and peril of symbolic action.
Yes.
Lots of ways we can go with this.
Mark, what is symbolic action?
Well, to me, the way I'm using it, and I think the line between a symbolic action and a direct action or some sort of organizing for social change is thin. Like, to me, symbolic action is part of the overall movement work. But to me, a symbolic action is one that you tweak the meaning of something without changing structures. So, for example, tearing down a statue, in some ways is a direct action because you're getting rid of something that's toxic, but it's largely symbolic because tearing down Christopher Columbus doesn't end colonization as a system or a set of structures. So another symbolic action would be winning Martin Luther King Day as a national holiday. Does something, but it's largely symbolic because it doesn't undo racism. So the question is what the role of symbolic action is, how useful is it, and how can it be actually work against us, which it does sometimes, which we'll talk about more. I don't know, how does that work for you as a working definition of symbolic action?
That's great. And and the complexity of it, right, is that symbols are important. And symbols are really, they can be helpful, they can be harmful. But part of what we're trying to get at here, and this is something that we see very commonly in social justice movements in America, particularly from white people, is that if all that you're doing is symbolic action, then that's where the problem comes in. Right? Because you think, oh, I did my symbolic action, now I can go home. Mm-hmm. And now we're sort of done. Yeah. And that is, that is something that Black and people of color and, queer activists talk about all the time. That that white people will show up for a small period of time. They'll show up for one or two things. And then they'll leave. And again, the challenge, right, is that for us who are white, we can opt back into whiteness. I did a little video about this the other night. We can just go back to, as the commercial says, the safety of our own home. Mm-hmm. And from the safety of our own home, we can be Instagram activists.
That's right. And to me, symbolic actions are part of it's important. Our society has a whole set of myths that keep us stupefied. And the way those myths kind of embed themselves in us is by us being surrounded by different messages and symbols. So disrupting that is important. So like when someone climbs up to a billboard that has advertisement and changes it so that somehow the advertisement is telling the truth, that's almost entirely a symbolic action, but there's power in it.
Right.
Then you get ones that, to me, like burning down the third precinct, is it symbolic or is it direct action? Well, it's both, because there's a huge symbol there, but you're also costing the police department money and time and energy and making it harder for them to do their job. So there's, whether you agree with the action or not, it's a direct action. That then was part of an overall struggle for systemic change, this case through policy. So it's kind of the abolition movement itself is more of a sustained action. So this is how you see it all working together. But, you know, if what happens is, especially, so white people do not have to be in the struggle for racial justice. We can opt in and out at will. And so if you get involved in a movement, show up on the streets for a while, say, I was there when the precinct burned, and you're like, I did it. I played my part. And then you go home. That's the kind of the pathology that white liberals and white progressives and white radicals all have when it comes to these things, is settling for symbolic wins.
Yeah, and you know, one way that we can understand it, if we want to, for a moment, take it out of the big picture of, you know, social justice and all these complicated things, is in our own personal lives, like when we're trying to make some sort of significant change, let's say for our health or our psychological well-being or our spiritual well-being, right? And so, you know, we maybe go to some expert or we read some self-help book or whatever, and we go, okay, you know, I need to eat better. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we give up chips for a week, we make a couple good meals, that's awesome. And then a couple weeks later, we find that we're back to eating the exact same crap that we ate before, right? And we know, you know, and exercise is another great example of this, right? And, you know, like Kathleen, you've been sharing, you've been doing some new exercise routines. And, you know, one of the things we know, right, is that we do exercise for a little bit. You know, the big joke, right, is about exercise equipment, how people buy exercise equipment and then it just becomes a coat hanger, you know, and people just pile their clothes on their exercise equipment. And so what we recognize is that in order to really transform ourselves and our lives, just doing one thing, it's easy for that to fade out and to disappear.
No, and this is, it's easy to, you have to fundamentally change your relationship with your body and with food, which is, you know, is the task. But I used to weigh over 100 pounds more than I do. Right. So if using this metaphor, like sometimes I'd decide, well, I'm going to buy this thing. So you'd go and buy this healthy thing and then think, well, look at me, I'm eating this healthy thing. And it's largely symbolic because eating one healthy thing doesn't disrupt anything. In my case, I got bariatric surgery, which is a type of revolution, I guess, if we're using this metaphor, because it forced me to fundamentally change my relationship with my body. But yeah, I feel like the metaphor of getting rid of Twinkies and eating some sort of energy bar that still has the same number of calories is a perfect metaphor for how white culture engaged with racial justice. Right. Comments are coming in.
Yeah, comments. Hey, Bobby, great.
Keep them coming.
Yeah, so
Bobby writes, it's easy to opt out. Too easy sometimes. I see my white allies taste a little heat and they don't want it. Never realized it was this hard.
Yeah, and so Bobby's a Chinese medicine expert and specialist at the Penny George Institute, and he's had some really funny Facebook posts about this, right? The phenomenon of white people suddenly telling him to read the best book on racism because they're now experts because they read one book, and some of these other things, and exactly that, you know, and I mean, what you're bringing up here is a really important thing because, again, as soon as you start to change, right, the systems that you're in connection with start to give you grief.
Yes.
right? And this is the same thing. Again, there are all kinds of personal things about this. So suddenly you go to a family gathering and you don't want to eat the same crap that your whole family eats. And so you ask them to make a different dish for you, or you bring your own food. And we know what happens, right?
You get
Suddenly
crap.
they get crap, they start making fun of you, they put you down, or they're like, well, we're not going to invite you to the Super Bowl party because you don't want to eat chips. And right, the systems start to force you to conform again. And then suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, like this change thing is tough. Maybe I just won't do this. Yeah.
Well,
So Sophia's got a.
Sophia writes, the university where I work observes MLK as a day off for students, but not for staff. Interesting. I'm on a team to ask that it be extended to staff as well. It is a gesture, but I think the symbolic gesture is and can be an entry to a broader and deeper conversation that inches us forward. If they say they honor the work of Reverend Dr. King, then the action statements, policies will reflect that. Our institution kicked out Reverend Dr. James Lawson, yet they continue to invoke his name while putting out bland statements. I'm assuming it goes on from there along the same line. Just as a reminder, for some reason, our system cuts off long comments, so we don't always see the end.
Yeah. So just keep commenting or make a couple short comments. Yeah. And so what you're getting at here is the really important issue of kind of tokenism in institutions. And so that's a great feed. I'm going to recommend another book. I already boosted one book way up the Amazon selling chart, so I'm going to do that with
You're
another.
You're a kingmaker, Dan.
I'm a kingmaker. Still haven't gotten that 20 million for Micah, but
it's coming. I got the check. I'm cutting you your half.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this is a really great book, Decolonizing Wealth. And this is by Edgar Villanueva, and who's a colleague and a friend of mine. And so he is writing this book about basically tokenism in philanthropy. Right. And, and this gets to a comment that another friend of mine made a couple of days ago that, token hiring practices are the institutional equivalents of thoughts and prayers, right, in the gun discussion. And so, what Edgar's talking about here was his experience of being hired as a really, brilliant, dynamic, person of color in a basically white institution, with all this promise of, oh yeah, we're going to change, we're going to do things differently, and then the stone wall that he ran into, where he really just saw that this was simply tokenism. This was actually not an institution desiring to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we see is that, yeah, I mean, to make these shifts is really, really difficult. And just as our personal ego habits prevent us from making personal transformations, so too the corporate ego habits prevent us from making corporate significant changes.
Sophia continues her comment, but because of these symbolic overtures, we can reference them to ask, push for more systems change rather than platitudes. And unfortunately, it's incumbent on the community to push the administration because they won't do it. For administrators, it likely ends with the platitudes. I mean, this is the thing. So when powerful systems give a symbolic change, a lot of people then go home and you have to keep pushing. But then usually the institution makes a big show of their symbolic things. Like, we're going to put a statue of MLK down in Washington, D.C. So we recognize that every symbolic action made or granted by powerful people is a win, but it's also bullshitty. Like, we all know that there's like this, you're not really doing the thing. Like, so I posted something about, now if white churches suddenly decide we're going to address the white images of Jesus in our church, if they do that, but then they don't ever ask, like, what does it mean to redistribute power and wealth in our congregation in a way that is representative of racial justice? Like, if you don't ever have that conversation, then those white statues of Jesus are still functionally there in your imagination anyway. So we all know, like, would white statues be gone? Would that be a good thing? Yes, but it's also a little bit of a bullshitty move unless you do something else. And I think we all have to just acknowledge that and understand that and say, okay, thank you for getting rid of the symbolic thing or doing the symbolic thing. Now we got to push. Otherwise, you're just a hypocrite. Like, we have to go there. And all too often, like, especially for liberal church folks, we're like all caught up in symbolic action. So we think, we've made our witness, and then we go home. As the witness is just symbolic.
Although sometimes even the symbolic actions are incredibly difficult and painful.
Oh my God.
So.
I don't want to minimize this, because like we all
Right.
know, if you've been involved in the struggle for justice even a little bit, it's like even getting that can be a giant pain in the ass.
All right, we got to jump back up to Gus.
Gus, one example along class lines that drives me bonkers every year is people volunteering to help feed unhoused people on or around Thanksgiving. It and Christmas are 2 days of the year we have, on other years anyway, where we could cancel our stuff and all our folks would still get fed. Yeah, and it's like, is getting fed on Thanksgiving good? Well, yeah. But there's a bullshittiness to it because people aren't engaged in
the rest of the year. Sometimes when we talk about these things theoretically, it's hard to wrap our heads around it. So concrete examples are always great. And one of my favorites related to Gus, what you're talking about, was there's this food shelf in Crookston that made meals as well for folks that were staying in a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. And so all these groups of good folks from the town would sign up to bring meals there. And so shortly after I got there, I went over there to talk to them about that. And so, I said, well, we're going to bring a meal and cook a meal, and then we're going to stay and eat with the residents and talk with them. And the woman that ran it was totally shocked. And she said, no group has ever stayed to eat with the residents, right? They drop the food off and then they run away. Mm-hmm. And again, this is this issue of, are we going to start changing relationships? And at first, the church folks were actually kind of scared of staying there and eating with the residents. And then when we started doing it, it was wonderful, and it gave those people, everybody, a completely different sense of relationship with folks who were staying there, right? So that, yeah, I mean, symbolic actions again are a great place to start, and then we also have to think, how are we changing our fundamental relationships with all kinds of things?
Mm-hmm. Laura writes, the symbols need to be removed to start sometimes. An example, if you have a hard time seeing how imagery of white Jesus upholds white supremacy, then let's talk about your church and their role in anti-racism in the community. I'm guessing it would be a very short conversation.
Right. Yeah, and again, the symbols are powerful, and the symbolic change is powerful, and a starting point. All right, Kathleen's got a few comments.
I know that for myself, I don't change unless I'm in major pain. That's kind of one of those sad fundamental truths. Losing a daughter 7 weeks ago caused me to rethink everything. I've lost friends over my support of taking down all monuments to the Confederacy.
Right. Yeah, and again, Kathleen, we are thinking about you in this period of grief and very difficult, I'm sure, time that you've been in with this. And and what you see, and this is one of the things that we do experience, and again, whiteness is nice for white people until you start to question it. And then you very quickly, as a white person, experience the violence and toxicity of it. Because suddenly people are, they're going to stop being your friends. They're going to shun you. Maybe you're going to lose jobs. You're going to have to change. And suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, like this isn't so nice, right? And I mean, certainly I've heard a lot of fundamentalist Christians talk about this, right? That you're in this nice lovey-dovey church and everybody loves you and it's beautiful until you say, oh, by the way, I'm gay. Or until you say, oh, I don't believe in substitutionary atonement. Or, was the virgin birth real? And suddenly all those people that have been loving on you your whole life, they don't seem to love you very much anymore.
Hmm. Kathleen also writes that it just occurred to me yesterday that most of my seminary education was quite racist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. In subtle and obvious ways. And it's the subtle ways that I think subtlety sometimes gets lost in symbolic actions. Because symbolic actions have to be kind of a little bit obvious to be caught. But most of oppression lives in the subtleties, it seems to me. I mean, that's my take on it. And that's harder for groups to uproot. Laura writes, tokenizing folks can also turn into weaponizing folks. That's the other big piece of this. It's the symbolic action that sometimes symbolic actions aren't even really wins. They're actually a way for them someone to grant something that seems like a symbolic win, and they're using it against you. Tokenization is a pretty big example of that. Right. So it basically says, look, we've got a black person on our board, so now we don't have to do any harder work.
Right. We've had a black president, so there's no more racism.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, Kathleen and everybody else, I just posted a great article about the issue of racism in seminary and other higher ed yesterday on my Facebook page. I highly recommend it. It's not very long, but it's really, really good. Okay.
Faith writes, yes, eat together, and good insight on symbolic actions. Needed that. I mean, there's a reason why Jesus focused on breaking bread. And, eating together doesn't cure everything, but it starts, at least especially in that society, to change your relationship with each other. And really, ultimately, if you're not changing relationships, both locally and then on a kind of a larger scale, then you're not really changing anything, not in any structural way.
Well, and and again, in Jesus's time and the way people understood eating together, it completely disrupted everything about how we understood God, how we understood society, how we understood favor and goodness. I mean, it really changed. It would have to change the entire way that society would start operating, right? Because of all of the understanding about cleanliness and things. And that's the same thing, that's true now. And, all of these isms set up the same kinds of boundaries of what is okay, what is not okay, who's privileged, who's not privileged. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, it translates to who does God like or not like, right? And when the change in relationships changes all of those boundaries. And that's what really begins to shift how things function. And again, the symbolic change can be a gateway into that, but only if we continue to shift those deeper things.
Maria writes, progress often, progress often comes with one step forward, two steps back. Racial justice is a marathon, but protests are sprints. I feel angry with myself for spending 3 hours responding to racist Facebook comments instead of fixing my house up. It's hard to know what is the highest priority.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, this is actually a really important thing in terms of the issue of strategy and tactics. And yeah, how do we spend our time as limited beings, right? That we don't have infinite amount of time. And, and one of the things, and this does not get really talked about enough in terms of the civil rights movement in the 60s, but one of the really brilliant things about what those folks were doing was not their great speeches that get played over and over again, but the fact that they were able to analyze the system and say, what are the actual action points that will disrupt the system in maximal ways, right? And so, the folks, when they looked at Martin Luther King and all the folks that were involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the folks who were involved with SNCC, which was the student organizing conference for changing, what they did is they looked at voting in the South, and they said, okay, look, there is this poll tax, right? So you actually had to pay to vote. And poor Black people could not afford the poll tax. And so they said, if we got rid of the poll tax, then everybody could vote, in theory, at least. There were other obstacles to voting. And so what they did is they went after the insistence of changing the poll tax in states across the South.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an incredibly powerful thing that really began to shift the whole balance of power. It's kind of like Jesus eating with the lepers, right? So take away the poll tax, and now all these Black people can vote, right? And so, so we need to look at our lives and the systems we're involved in and really say, all right, what are some of these pressure points? What are some of the ways that we can disrupt and actually shift what is going on that will begin to bring about some of these changes for justice?
Mm-hmm. And this is, where a lot of people will look at things like the uprising, some people call them riots, or interstate shutdowns, and dismiss them because it doesn't make sense at a symbolic level all the time. Like shutting down interstate doesn't do anything symbolically potent at all. It's shutting down interstate. It's inconvenient. But what it does is causes disruption and forces people to start paying attention, which white America wouldn't pay attention to Black Lives Matter if they weren't inconvenienced by it. That's a tactic. To me, the most beautiful and powerful tactics are ones that are symbolically rich and also disruptive. Sit-ins, like lunch counter sit-ins and bus boycotts, things like that, kind of get at both. But still, at the end of the day, disrupting a system so people have to pay attention, even if it isn't symbolically powerful, that's the sort of stuff we have on short supply. And we have a lot of symbolic actions that get lost in the noise.
Yeah. And again, this is why, you mentioned sit-ins. And one of the sit-in movements that I was involved with a long time ago was when we were trying to get the University of California to divest from South Africa, which again, we felt was a very powerful pressure point, because here you had a multi-billion-dollar investment fund. And if they pulled out of South African investment, that would start the dominoes rolling at a lot of different universities and things, which in fact it ultimately did. And what we did was we just occupied the administration building, and when suddenly those administrators that Sophia, you were talking about earlier, when they couldn't get to work because, there were 500 of us in the lobby just sitting there, that forced their hand in terms of getting their attention. And when we made it clear that each time they arrested us, we were just going to be back to sit in, that was the thing that started getting the kind of publicity that ultimately got the regents to divest in South Africa, which was real tipping points in terms of that whole movement. Jeremy's up.
Great comment from Jeremy, and I'll probably have to end out with this. He writes, "I'm struck that Christian community is symbolic of all this radical calling for change. It's a symbolic practice. Yet the symbolism has perhaps let us off the hook of actually living it out." I could go off for a half hour on this alone, but to me, churches have ceded so much so that we exist entirely in the symbolic layer. And to me, the power of the church isn't in its symbolic potency, but in the possibility that you have gathered communities who can fundamentally restructure the way they relate with one another. Communion wasn't just a symbolic, oh, this is Jesus. They were Jubilee meals. They were agape love feasts where people were forced to even redistribute their wealth in light of it. And that's why Paul went off on folks who, when people were being economically unjust while they're also at the same time having the communion meal, he'd say you're eating basically the food of demons when you do that. And so this question of like, and again, church folks are the most symbolic in engaging in any of these protests and actions. We show up with our stoles on for symbolic things instead of doing the grind work. I mean, not all clergy, like tons of local clergy have been involved in the grind work, but we know what the tendency is. And so to me, like if when churches say, oh, we're supposed to be a counter community to the empires of this world, and if you're only doing that symbolically, you're not doing it. That's just kind of what it comes down to. Start asking, right, how can we fundamentally restructure the way we relate with one another?
Right. And so Sophia's got, this is a great comment to go out on.
Yes, have to ask, what are the pain pressure points that could change behavior? Policies. Usually one of them is money.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, exactly. So, so again, we all are connected to systems. We all are connected to systems of activity, churches, jobs, families, recreational centers, whatever. So look at those systems and say, what really could be different here for justice? And what are the ways that I could start bringing that up? And then watch yourself get kicked out of that system. And then you can blame us.
Until you can, and then if you get enough people like mine, you can organize ways to occupy parts of that system and maybe even like flip it. That's when revolution happens. So.
All right. And remember, hack the robot birds and get them on your side.
And in the meantime,
the power.
That's right.
All right. So thanks for all the great comments. We'll see you on Monday.
See you next week, everybody.
Bye.